Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that while Donald Trump was threatening tariffs and demanding American companies abandon China, Canada was in Beijing rolling out the red carpet for the world's largest electric vehicle battery manufacturer? And what if I told you that this single meeting could completely undermine America's $100 billion effort to dominate the electric vehicle revolution? Yesterday, in Beijing, Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down with executives from contemporary Amperex Technology Company Limited, known globally as CATL. For those unfamiliar with this company, let me put their dominance in perspective. CATL produces more EV batteries than any other company on Earth. They supply Tesla, BMW, Volkswagen, Ford, and virtually every major automaker pursuing electrification. They hold roughly 37% of the global EV battery market share. When you see an electric vehicle on the road, there's better than 1 in 3 chance that a CATL battery is powering it. And Canada just invited them to invest in our country, to build facilities on Canadian soil, to access Canadian critical minerals, to integrate into the North American supply chain that the United States has been spending billions of dollars trying to exclude them from. The headline is straightforward. Canada invited China's biggest EV battery maker to invest. But the implications are staggering. This is not just about batteries or electric vehicles. This is about the future of the automotive industry, about supply chain dominance, about which countries will control the technologies that power the 21st century economy. And Canada just made a move that has the potential to completely outflank American strategy. Today, we need to understand exactly what happened in that Beijing boardroom, why CATL matters so profoundly, what Canada gains from this partnership, and most critically, why this represents Trump's electric vehicle nightmare coming to life. Because when you understand the full picture, you'll realize that Canada just executed one of the most audacious strategic moves in modern industrial policy. Before we examine the details, if you value analysis that reveals the strategic thinking behind the headlines, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these insights every day. To understand why CATL matters, why this meeting in Beijing is so significant, we need to first understand a fundamental truth about the electric vehicle revolution. Whoever controls battery production controls the entire industry. This is not an exaggeration. This is industrial reality. An electric vehicle is, fundamentally, a battery on wheels. The battery represents approximately 40% of the total cost of the vehicle. It determines the range, the performance, the charging time, the safety, the lifespan. Everything that matters to a consumer about an EV comes down to the battery. The rest, the motors, the chassis, the software, these are important but secondary to the fundamental question: how good is the battery? This means that automotive companies, the legacy giants like Ford and General Motors and the new entrants like Tesla, are actually in a precarious position. They assemble vehicles, but they don't control the core technology. They're dependent on battery suppliers. And the global battery supply chain is dominated by a handful of companies, with CATL sitting at the very top of that pyramid. CATL didn't achieve this dominance by accident. They invested tens of billions of dollars in research and development. They pioneered lithium iron phosphate battery chemistry that's cheaper and safer than alternatives. They built massive production facilities, achieving economies of scale that competitors cannot match. They secured supply chains for critical minerals, particularly lithium and cobalt, through investments in mines across Africa, South America, and Asia. They are vertically integrated from mine to finished battery cell, controlling every step of the process. When CATL can produce a battery pack for 20% less than their nearest competitor, when they can deliver superior performance at lower cost, automakers have a choice. Use CATL batteries and be competitive, or use alternative suppliers and watch your vehicles get priced out of the market. For most automakers, this is not really a choice at all. Now, here's where this becomes geopolitically explosive. CATL is a Chinese company, not just a company that happens to be based in China, but a company with deep ties to the Chinese government, a company that benefits from Chinese industrial subsidies, a company that operates as part of China's strategic effort to dominate the electric vehicle supply chain globally. The United States has recognized this threat. The Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022, included specific provisions designed to exclude Chinese battery companies from the American market. The law provides substantial tax credits for electric vehicles, but only if the batteries are made in North America or by allied countries, explicitly excluding China. The entire point of this legislation, beyond the climate benefits, was to build a domestic American battery supply chain that doesn't depend on Chinese technology or Chinese companies. The U.S. has spent over $100 billion, combining government subsidies and a private investment, trying to build battery manufacturing capacity on American soil. They've provided grants to companies like Panasonic, LG Energy Solution, and Samsung SDI to build factories in the United States. They've tried to secure critical mineral supplies from Australia, Canada, and South America. They've implemented tariffs and trade restrictions designed to make Chinese batteries uncompetitive in American markets. And yesterday, Canada sat down with KATL and said, "We'd like you to invest here. We'd like you to build in Canada. We have the minerals you need, the skilled workforce, the stable political environment. Let's talk partnership." Do you understand what just happened? Canada just opened a door that the United States has been desperately trying to keep closed, and that door leads directly into the heart of the North American automotive supply chain. Now, some of you might be asking, why would CATL want to invest in Canada? They're a Chinese company. They have massive production facilities in China with low costs and government support. What does Canada offer that makes this partnership attractive? The answer lies in three critical advantages that Canada possesses. Advantages that are not just competitive, but in some cases absolutely unique. First, critical minerals. Building batteries requires specific materials: lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and increasingly rare earth elements. These minerals must be mined, processed, refined to extremely high purity standards, and then manufactured into battery components. China currently dominates the supply chain, controlling roughly 70 to 80% of global processing capacity for most critical minerals. But the actual minerals, the stuff in the ground, those are distributed globally. And Canada has them. Massive deposits. We have lithium in Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. We have nickel in Ontario and Quebec. We have cobalt as a byproduct of our nickel mining. We have some of the world's largest graphite deposits in Quebec. We have rare earths in Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories. For decades, we've been exporting these raw materials to China for processing. Canadian ore leaves our ports, gets refined in Chinese facilities, gets manufactured into battery components in Chinese factories, and then gets sold back to us as finished batteries. We've been playing the role of resource colony in the battery supply chain, extracting raw materials but capturing none of the value-added manufacturing. What Canada is now proposing to CATL is, instead of shipping raw materials to China, process them here. Build the refineries in Canada. Build the component manufacturing facilities in Canada. We'll provide the materials, the energy to process them, the workforce to operate the facilities, and the stable regulatory environment to ensure long-term investment security. In return, you get secure access to critical mineral supply chains that aren't subject to the geopolitical tensions affecting Chinese mining operations in Africa or South America. For KATL, this is extraordinarily attractive. Mining is increasingly difficult in unstable regions. The Democratic Republic of Congo, which produces the majority of the world's cobalt, faces ongoing conflict and governance challenges. South American lithium operations face water scarcity issues and indigenous rights conflicts. Securing a stable, reliable source of critical minerals from a G7 democracy is worth substantial investment. Second, energy. Processing critical minerals into battery-grade materials is phenomenally energy-intensive. Refining lithium, for example, requires enormous amounts of electricity. The carbon footprint of battery production is heavily dependent on how clean the electricity source is. Canada has abundant clean energy. Hydroelectric power in Quebec and British Columbia provides some of the cheapest, cleanest electricity in the world. When CATL builds a refinery powered by Quebec Hydro, the resulting battery components have a dramatically lower carbon footprint than the same components produced using coal power in China or even natural gas power in many other countries. This matters enormously because Europe and increasingly other markets are implementing carbon border adjustments. Batteries produced with high carbon intensity will face tariffs. Batteries produced with clean Canadian hydroelectric power will not. Canada offers CATL a way to produce components that meet the increasingly stringent environmental standards of Western markets while maintaining cost competitiveness. Third, and this is the strategic masterstroke, market access. Here's where Canada's unique position becomes a geopolitical weapon. Canada is part of USMCA, the trade agreement with the United States and Mexico. We have tariff-free access to the American market for manufactured goods, including automotive components, provided they meet certain North American content requirements. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act tries to exclude Chinese battery technology from American EV subsidies. But here's the beautiful complexity. If KATL builds facilities in Canada, if they use Canadian minerals, if they employ Canadian workers, those batteries are, legally speaking, Canadian products. They're made in North America. They could potentially qualify for USMCA benefits. They could potentially access the American market in ways that batteries made in China absolutely cannot. The US tried to build a regulatory wall to keep Chinese battery technology out. Canada just showed CATL a gate in that wall. Whether that gate actually opens, whether the legal and regulatory structures will allow KATL products made in Canada to access American markets, that's yet to be determined. There will be fierce debates, legal challenges, regulatory interpretations, but the possibility exists. And the mere possibility is enough to make this investment attractive to CATL and absolutely terrifying to American policymakers. Let's examine the timing of this meeting because it reveals careful strategic planning, not opportunistic reaction. Carney didn't randomly decide to meet with CATL executives while he was in Beijing. This was planned. This was deliberate. And the timing tells us everything about Canada's strategic intent. The meeting happened immediately after Trump called the USMCA trade agreement irrelevant, immediately after he threatened Canadian manufacturing, immediately after he made clear that his administration views trade with Canada as a problem to be solved rather than a partnership to be valued. This timing is not coincidental. Canada is sending multiple messages simultaneously, and they're all important. To the United States, the message is, if you exclude us from your markets, if you treat our manufacturing as a threat rather than an asset, we will build alternative partnerships that make us less dependent on your goodwill. You want to play hardball on trade? Fine. Watch us integrate with the world's dominant battery supplier while you struggle to build domestic capacity. To China, the message is, Canada is open for business. We have what you need. We're a stable, reliable partner. And unlike the United States, we're not going to change the rules on you every 4 years based on domestic political wins. Invest here with confidence. To the global automotive industry, the message is, Canada is positioning itself to be the critical link in the EV supply chain. We have the minerals. We're welcoming the technology leaders. We have clean energy. We have trade access to the world's largest markets. If you want to build electric vehicles competitively, if you want secure supply chains, Canada is where you need to be. But there's a deeper strategic context we need to understand. The electric vehicle transition is not optional. It's happening. Every major automaker has announced plans to electrify their fleets. The European Union has set deadlines for phasing out internal combustion engines. California and other jurisdictions are implementing similar mandates. China is pushing EV adoption aggressively. The question is not whether the automotive industry will electrify, but who will control the supply chains that make electrification possible. The United States wants that control. They've made it a national priority. They've spent billions. They've implemented protectionist policies. They've tried to strong-arm allies into excluding Chinese companies, but they're struggling because building a battery supply chain is phenomenally difficult and expensive. Mining takes decades to permit and develop. Processing facilities require massive capital investment and technical expertise. The Chinese didn't build their dominance overnight. It took 20 years of sustained investment and strategic planning. Canada looked at this landscape and recognized an opportunity. We have advantages that the U.S. doesn't have. Abundant critical minerals that are easier to permit and develop than in the U.S. Cleaner energy, a less politically polarized regulatory environment. We can build parts of the supply chain faster and more cost-effectively than America can. But we lack the technology and the massive production scale. That's what CATL brings. They have the expertise, the intellectual property, the production knowledge, the global market connections. A partnership between Canadian advantages and Chinese capabilities could create a battery supply chain powerhouse that neither country could build alone. The timing is perfect because the industry is at an inflection point. The next 5 years will determine who dominates EV battery production for the next 30. Canada is making sure we're not left out, that we're not relegated to being simply a raw material supplier. We're positioning ourselves to capture the value-added manufacturing, the good jobs, the economic benefits of the EV transition. And if that positioning happens to completely undermine American attempts to exclude China from North American supply chains, well, perhaps the United States should have treated Canada with more respect. Let's be very clear about what terrifies American policymakers about this potential Canada-CATL partnership. This isn't just about batteries. This is about the collapse of a carefully constructed strategic framework designed to maintain American technological and economic dominance. The United States has operated under a doctrine of strategic decoupling from China. The idea is to separate American and Chinese economies in critical technology sectors to prevent Chinese access to advanced capabilities and to ensure American supply chain security. Billions have been spent, policies have been implemented, alliances have been pressured to comply. This is bipartisan American consensus, supported by both Democrats and Republicans. Electric vehicle batteries are a crown jewel of this decoupling effort. The Inflation Reduction Act was designed to build a completely Chinese-free EV supply chain. American minds, American processing, American battery production, American vehicles. The goal was energy independence 2.0, not for oil, but for the clean energy economy. Now imagine this scenario, and this is what keeps planners in Washington up at night. CATL builds massive battery component manufacturing facilities in Ontario and Quebec. They use Canadian lithium, Canadian nickel, Canadian graphite. They power these facilities with clean Canadian hydro. They employ thousands of Canadian workers. The batteries are, by any legal definition, made in Canada. Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, all have major operations in Canada. They build millions of vehicles in Canadian plants that are then sold in American markets under USMCA. If those vehicles use batteries with CATL components manufactured in Canada, are they American-made for the purposes of the Inflation Reduction Act? The legal answer is genuinely unclear. Trade lawyers will argue this for years. But even if the U.S. manages to exclude CATL-linked batteries from American subsidies, there's a darker scenario. Canadian-made vehicles with CATL batteries can still be sold in American markets. They just won't qualify for the tax credits. But if CATL batteries are 20% cheaper than American alternatives, the price advantage might outweigh the lost subsidy. Canadian manufacturers could produce more affordable EVs than American competitors, capturing market share and forcing American automakers to either raise prices and lose sales or use CATL components themselves and lose subsidies. Either way, American companies lose. Either way, the domestic battery industry that the U.S. spent $100 billion trying to build becomes uncompetitive. Either way, Chinese technology ends up in the North American supply chain despite American efforts to exclude it. The nightmare deepens when you consider the precedent. If Canada can successfully integrate Chinese battery technology despite American opposition, what stops Mexico from doing the same? What stops other American allies from making similar calculations? The entire decoupling strategy relies on a united front of Western allies refusing to give China access to their markets and supply chains. If that front cracks, if countries start making individual deals with China based on their own economic interests, American leverage collapses. Furthermore, there's a military dimension that cannot be ignored. Electric vehicles are increasingly important for defense. Military vehicles, support equipment, even some weapon systems are exploring electrification for performance and logistical advantages. If the North American EV supply chain includes Chinese technology, if CATL components are in vehicles used by American or Canadian militaries, that creates potential vulnerabilities. Could China build backdoors into battery management systems? Could they create dependencies that could be exploited in a crisis? These might sound like paranoid concerns, but they're exactly the kind of scenarios that defense planners must consider. And Canada inviting CATL to invest forces American defense and intelligence communities to plan for those scenarios in ways they hoped they'd never have to. Now, I want to be balanced here because this strategy is not without risks for Canada. We need to be clear-eyed about what we're potentially getting into. First, we risk damaging our relationship with the United States on an issue they consider a core national security priority. The Americans have made clear they view Chinese involvement in critical technology supply chains as an existential threat. By welcoming CATL, Canada is directly contradicting American policy. This will create tension. There will be pressure from Washington. There could be retaliation. Second, we risk becoming dependent on Chinese technology and Chinese companies in a strategically important sector. If CATL builds substantial facilities in Canada, if Canadian battery production becomes reliant on their intellectual property and their supply chain connections, we've traded one dependency for another. Instead of being dependent on American markets, we become dependent on Chinese technology. That has its own vulnerabilities. Third, there are legitimate concerns about technology transfer and intellectual property. CATL will want protections for their proprietary technology. How do we ensure that Canadian workers and Canadian companies learn from this partnership? That we build domestic expertise rather than just becoming an assembly location for Chinese-designed components? These are real risks. They deserve serious consideration. But here's the strategic calculation Canada appears to be making. The risks of remaining exclusively dependent on the United States, of having no alternatives, of being subject to whatever trade policies Washington decides to implement on any given day, those risks are greater than the risks of diversifying our partnerships. Moreover, Canada isn't putting all its eggs in the CATL basket. We're also working with other battery manufacturers. We have domestic mining companies developing capabilities. We're investing in research at Canadian universities. The CATL partnership is one component of a broader strategy to ensure Canada has a meaningful role in the EV supply chain. We're hedging our bets, building multiple pathways, ensuring that we have options. The meeting with CATL is also a negotiating tactic. When Canada sits down with American officials to discuss trade, to discuss USMCA renewal, to discuss any number of bilateral issues, we can now credibly say we have other options. If you want our critical minerals to flow exclusively to American battery makers, if you want to ensure Chinese technology doesn't enter North American supply chains through Canada, then you need to treat us as equal partners, not as subordinates. This is leverage. This is Canada, demonstrating that we understand the game being played and that we're willing to make moves that serve Canadian interests, even if those moves make Washington uncomfortable. Friends, what we're witnessing is not theoretical. This is not a distant possibility. This is the future being constructed right now in real time through meetings in Beijing, boardrooms, and investment decisions being made by corporate executives and government policies being written in Ottawa. The electric vehicle revolution is the largest industrial transformation since the shift from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles over a century ago. The companies and countries that position themselves correctly will prosper for generations. Those that miss this transition will find themselves economically marginalized, dependent on others for the technologies that power modern life. Canada has a choice. We can be passive observers, exporting raw materials and watching the value-added manufacturing happen elsewhere. Or we can be active participants, leveraging our advantages to ensure we capture a meaningful share of the economic benefits. The meeting with KATL signals that Canada has chosen the latter path. We're going to be players, not spectators. We're going to use our critical minerals, our clean energy, our strategic position to build a battery industry that creates jobs, generates wealth, and gives us leverage in an increasingly multipolar world. Will this make the United States uncomfortable? Absolutely. Will it create diplomatic tensions? Probably. Will it require careful management of complex relationships with both Washington and Beijing? Without question. But the alternative, remaining in a position of structural dependence on an American market that has demonstrated its willingness to use trade as a political weapon, that's not acceptable. Canada is charting a different course. We're building options. We're securing our future. And if that future includes Chinese investment in Canadian battery facilities, so be it. The world is changing. The assumptions that governed the past 70 years are breaking down. Canada can either cling to those old assumptions and hope for the best, or we can adapt to the new reality. Yesterday's meeting in Beijing shows which path we've chosen. I want to hear from you. Do you think Canada is making the right choice by welcoming CATL investment? Are you concerned about Chinese involvement in our strategic industries, or do you see this as smart economic policy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This decision will shape Canadian manufacturing and Canadian prosperity for decades to come, and your voice matters in this debate. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're tracking these fundamental shifts in industrial policy and global supply chains every day, and your support helps us continue this critical work. Friends, thank you for being here today. Canada is positioning itself for the electric vehicle future. We're making bold moves that prioritize Canadian interests, and we're demonstrating that even in a world dominated by superpowers, a well-positioned middle power with the right resources can punch far above its weight. Thank you.